Hello everyone, welcome to Joystick Lab. In this tutorial, we're going to look into Firebase authentication using Google Sign-in. We're going to use OAuth 2.0 and we are going to do this in an iOS app and for our standalone Unity app. Before we jump into today's lesson, I wanted to share my upcoming AR course with you. It's a limited seat AR masterclass where I'll take you from a beginner to an expert in AR app development. We'll build more than 15 projects in this process and we'll dig into all the features AR Foundation provides. This course will be updated once every year to keep things updated with the updates of AR Foundation and Unity. And you'll also be able to join with me on live monthly Q&A sessions and get access to the closed community that comes with the course, right? And if you order today, you can get a huge 70% discount on the course. So visit ar.joysticklab.com and grab your copy. Let's start by talking about the problem first. So we have this app where we want to implement the Google sign-in. However, if we had to do this with the current way, there is a few options we have. First of all, we have this Google Sign-in Unity plugin. This is about 6 years old and it has a lot of issues and we have to fix that with some workaround. So there is no recent update on that. Next, we can use Unity's Google Authentication service. However, it basically depends on Google Play game plugin, which is going to require some credential that you can get from the Play Store. If we wanted to do this for iOS, it should not be straightforward. Now, if we had to authenticate our game using Firebase, we also going to need a ID token that we need to get from this instruction from Android or iOS. Now, there is no native Unity way to do this. Either we had to use that plugin that I showed you earlier, or we had to create our own plugin that basically works for both iOS and Android, which is again not straightforward, obviously. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the OAuth service to basically authenticate our user. How this is going to work is that if we had a Google Cloud project, we can authenticate the user using OAuth services, right? So all we need now is a plugin that supports OAuth 2 for Unity. That is exactly where this i5 toolkit for Unity comes into play. This plugin has a lot of features, but one of them is a service that is going to help us to use OAuth for our authentication. You can see there is an OpenID Connect client feature. This is what we're going to use to authenticate our user using the Google Cloud's authentication API. So before we get started, let's go back to our Google Cloud console and we're going to create a new project. If you don't have a Google Cloud console, you can simply search for Google Cloud console online in Google and you're going to come to this page where you can sign up to a new account. I already have an account, so I'm just going to create a new project. When the project is done, we can go inside the project by selecting that project, and from the left hand side you're going to see there is an option called API and services. So we're going to go in there and we are going to add a new OAuth credential. So click on credentials and from here you can create credentials. So if I click on there and go to OAuth client ID, you're going to basically see there is a warning that asks us to create a consent screen. So this is the screen where we take consent from the user to sign in using their Google ID. So let's create a new OAuth consent screen. We're going to give this a name and a support email. And finally, if you scroll down, there's a contact information for the developer. I'm going to use the same email and save and continue. You can add more stuff in there, so you can basically add logos and other information. I'm just going to keep everything simple right now. When we come back to dashboard, there is an option to publish our app. We're going to hit publish app to production. And now we can go back to credential and create a new credential for our app. So again, click on create credentials and click on OAuth client ID. From here, we're going to select the application type. For our case, we're going to use an iOS app. You can do the similar sort of stuff for Android and web application. So using this plugin, we can basically authenticate users in any platform, right? So it's just about like putting the correct API token that comes with this client ID. So I'm going to select iOS for now and give this a name. And this one is important, so we need to make sure that the bundle identifier that we use in our app is similar to the one that we use here. So let's go back to our Unity project and see what bundle identifier that we used. Inside Unity, we can go to File, Build Settings and Player Settings, and there we'll have a company name and product name. And if you scroll down, that is basically creates the bundle identifier, right? So com.joysticklab.sign-in-test, that is my bundle identifier. I'm going to go back and paste that in here and click on this create button. So our client ID is now created. Now we can go back to Unity and import the necessary asset that we're going to need. So like I mentioned earlier, we're going to use this i5 toolkit for Unity. In the right hand side of this page, you're going to see there is a release button. So go ahead, click on there, scroll down and download the Unity package that contains the necessary things that we are going to need. I already have downloaded this, so I'm just going to import that inside Unity. All right, so you can simply drag and drop that Unity asset into your Unity assets folder, and then you're going to have this new folder called i5 toolkit for Unity. Now to connect this with our client ID, we're going to need to have the client ID that we got from Google console, right? So we're going to go to our authentication again, and then credential, and then click on this client ID, and you're going to find there is a client ID on the right hand side of the screen. So we need to copy this. In here, we're going to create a new OpenID connect client data. I'm going to name this Google client, and you can expand this, and we are going to basically copy that client ID. So pay attention one thing here, that there is no client secret for the iOS app. If you were doing this for web, you are going to need a client secret as well, right? So I'm going to save this, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to just to test it out in our Unity editor. We're going to create another client data. This is going to be just for testing, and this is going to be a example for the web. So we're going to authenticate our user inside this client app or inside this editor using the web version. So let's go back to Google again, and this part that I'm showing right now, this is completely not required. This is just for us to test it out in our editor. So just like we did before, we can create a new OAuth client ID, select web application, and then we are going to need some authorized URL. I'm going to show that a little bit later. For now, let's just create, and we're going to have a client ID and client secret. So let's copy that. Now we're going to create a script that is going to handle this authentication for us. So let's right click, create a C# script, and we're going to name this Google sign-in auth. First thing that we're going to need is to add some reference for both of our client data object that we created. So I'm just going to do client data object for Google client data. That is the one that we're going to use for iOS, and then we have a editor one, and then we are going to need a few namespaces. So i5.toolkit.core, OpenID connect client, we're going to need that as well. Nice. And then we are going to basically extend this class from a bootstrapper. So rather than extending from mono behavior, we are going to extend from the base service bootstrapper, and we're also going to need some certain namespaces for that. So these are the two namespaces that we're going to need, and this has a few methods that we're going to need to implement. So let's do that. So we are going to basically write our code in here. When the register service has been invoked, we are going to do something, right? So we're going to first do a initialization for our OpenID connector service. This plugin already has a connector for Google, so we are going to basically use that. Like I said before, now we have two different like client data object. We are simply going to pass them based on where we are, right? So if we are in an editor, we are going to do something, and if we are not in an editor, we're going to do something else. So for the iOS devices, we can do something like this, and then if we are in an editor, then we're going to do something else, and we're going to do end if. So yeah, so as you can see, for iOS devices, we are using the client data object, and for our editor, we are just going to use the editor only client data object. Next, we are going to need a redirect URL. So basically what happens here is that when the sign up is completed, we need to redirect the user to some URL. For our editor or for web, is going to be any valid HTTPS URL. So I'm just going to do this one. So it goes back to the Polymuse website. Otherwise, we are going to do something different for our iOS device. So this is called deep linking. Let's talk a little bit about what deep link is. Okay, so in plain English, deep link is basically an URL. So when you click on that URL, if you have that app installed, it basically takes you to that app, to the certain content that you want to show, and you can configure that in your app. We're going to do that. If you don't have that app installed, it is going to take you to the App Store, and it will ask the user to download that app. Now, a deep link is usually made up with two parts, a scheme and a host or a path, right? So for example, the first part of a deep link is basically the scheme, and the second part is a host path. So in our case, if we don't have any certain method or certain path that you want to follow, we can just keep that empty. And the scheme is typically the bundle identifier of the app, right? It can be anything, but the bundle identifier of the app is basically what we typically do when we are deep linking an app with Google Authentication or any third-party services. Now, how you can basically configure the deep link, you can get this information in detail in this page as well. I'm going to put that link in the description. One thing I want to mention here, we are building for iOS, so the process is pretty straightforward. If you had to do that for Android, it's also straightforward, but you basically need to have a separate manifest file inside the plugin folder. So yeah, make sure you do that if you're building this thing for Android. Now for iOS, we can simply go to File and Build Settings. In the Player Settings, if you scroll down inside Other Settings, you're going to find an option called Supported URL Schemes, and we're going to put a size of 1, and in here we're going to put the URL. The first part again is going to be the bundle identifier, and for now we're going to keep the second part empty because we are not pinging to a certain method. But again, if you go to that link on deep link, in here you're going to see some advanced use cases. So if you have a certain path that you want to follow, if you want to call a certain method after this, you can do that as well. For our case, we are not going to do anything like that. We're going to come back to the app where it initialized or initiated the sign-in request. So what we need to do now is to use this URI as our redirect URI, so that when the user is signed in, it's going to be redirected to our app. And this deep link part is automatically handled by the plugin, so we don't have to do anything manually. It's going to be taken care of automatically, right? Now, when we are running this in the editor, we are also going to need the listening URI. So this is just a local host and just a port number that I added in here. And then finally, we just need to have the service manager to register this service that we created. The last thing that we need to do is to get rid of this start method from here. The base class already has a start method, so it will hide that definition, so we need to get rid of that. Back to our Unity editor, we can create an empty game object, rename that, and then drag and drop the script that we just wrote. We're going to need both of these client data, so drag and drop those data as well, and save your scene. Alright, so next we are going to create another C# script. In this script, we are basically going to authenticate the user and then add that user's information to Firebase. So we're going to authenticate with Google and then basically use that information to authenticate the user inside Firebase. So first, we're going to create a task that is going to take care of the authentication. In this async function, we are simply going to basically create the login completed event, and we're going to add a callback when that login is completed. You need to import some of the namespaces that comes with i5, and we're also going to create that callback method that we are going to use later on. And here you also need to basically open up the sign-in page, so let's create a await for that. All right, and then just for now, we're going to basically try to debug this to see if everything is working. And one last thing we're going to do is to create a public method which we can use for the button click event. Let's get back to Unity again, create another game object, drag and drop the auth manager, and then in the button, we're going to create a on click event, and drag and drop that game object, go to our function, auth manager, and then sign in. Let's try this out. If we click on the Google sign in button, it takes us to this page and we can select one of the email and will take us back to the app, and you can see here it says sign in is done, so everything is working. The next step is to add Firebase into that. So I'm not going to show you how you can install Firebase in your Unity app. You're going to find a lot of tutorials out there on how to do that. Simply, I created a Firebase project and then imported the assets for authentication services in Firebase. And we also need to make sure that in the streaming assets, we have the Google services.json file, right? So yeah, do all that, and also you need to make sure that in your authentication page, in the sign-in method, you need to make sure that you have this Google as a provider, right? So again, all this information you can find online. If you get stuck at any point, let me know in the comment. I'll try to untangle you. All right, so when you have your Firebase set up, the first thing that we're going to do is to initialize the Firebase auth. So to do that, we're going to first of all declare a variable, and in our start method, we're going to initialize the auth service with the default instance. And when the sign-in is completed in here, rather than just debugging that information, we can now simply create a credential based on the token that we get from this sign-in information, right? So how we can get the token is simply from the service manager. So in the service manager, we have something called access token, right? So this is the value that we're going to need in a bit. So let's create a variable for that. And then in the Firebase documentation page, you're going to find this script to authenticate with Firebase inside the Unity documentation part. I'm going to copy this code and we're going to paste it in here. All we need is the access token that we just got from here. We're going to keep this ID token as null, and the access token is going to be this one. Now, if we try this out one last time, let's run the game. I'm going to sign in with something else this time, maybe this one. And let's get back to our Unity editor, and you can see we have the user successfully signed in with a user ID as well. Let's go back to our Firebase projects to see if the user actually got added or not. As you can see, the user has been added to our users panel in Firebase. I hope this video was helpful for you to authenticate your users using Google Sign In and add them to Firebase. If you have any question, feel free to drop that in the comment box. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for future updates. I'll see you in the next one.